Yalimadad, Khushamdeed. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to our second day, second session of the college program on Islam. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Shainool Jiwa with us, who will be talking on the Shi'i conceptions of authority in Islam. But before we begin, I would like to welcome you all, welcome Dr. Shainool Jiwa, and also give a brief introduction to what we are doing and why we are here, particularly for those who were not with us yesterday. So the college program on Islam began in the summer of 2002 for the Shia Ismaili Muslims, and it was a reaction to the events of September 11, 2001. The program directors responded to the concerns of several young Ismailis about how to articulate what it means to be Muslim, seeking to fill in a gap in US universities and colleges which lacked a strong Islamic studies program. CPOI became a place where Ismaili college students across the United States were able to access rigorous academic study of Islam and particularly Ismaili Tariqa. So this winter CPOI mini-series seeks to help us all gain the language and tools to grapple with the complexity of faith and the moral and ethical imperatives to engage in Islam as a lived faith centering justice and promoting civil society. In addition, the mini-series intends to present different perspectives and scholarly work that are representative of the topics at hand, with an eye to encouraging reflection and further study. It also intends to present a series of scaffolded presentations that are also episodic in nature, allowing for easy entry into conversations. Meanwhile, for those who attend all the sessions, the topics will engage in an exploration of different levels of action from individual to community-based as a means to explore systematic impact over time. As we all know, the theme for this year's mini-series is Exploring the Foundations, where we intend to take our participants through a review of the foundational concepts found in Islam, particularly understanding the role of the Holy Quran in 7th century Arabia and then in lives of Muslims, and conceptions of authority in Shia Islam. It also intends to help students understand the role of ritual practices in Islam and the beauty in the diversity of these practices today. So in today's session, exploring conceptions of authority in Shi'i Islam with Dr. Shainool Jiwa, we explore frameworks that link notions of authority that were understood after the death of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the key underpinnings of Shi'i notions of authority, and the diversity of authority that exists within the Shi'i context and the broader Muslim context. Now it is my honor to introduce our speaker for the day. Dr. Shainool Jiwa, as most of us know her, is a specialist in Fatimid studies and a senior research fellow at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, London. Dr. Jiwa's latest publication, The Fatimids, The Rise of a Muslim Empire, was published in 2018 and is a World of Islam series title for which she also serves as series general editor. She's also the co-editor of The Shi'i World, Pathways in Tradition and Modernity, which was published in 2015, and The Fatimid Caliphate, Diversity of Tradition, which was published in 2017. So as we all can see, she has published several monographs and co-edited volumes. Dr. Jiwa has edited and translated key medieval Arabic texts relating to Fatimid history, including Towards a Shi'i Mediterranean Empire, which was published in 2009, and The Founder of Cairo, which was published in 2013. Dr. Jiwa has completed her PhD in Islamic Studies from University of Edinburgh and an MA in Islamic Studies from McGill University, along with a postgraduate certificate in higher education, leading to a fellowship in Higher Education Academy. Wow, what an impressive profile. Once again, we welcome you on behalf of the entire US Jamaat and US Jamaati institutions. Thank you so much for all your services to the field, to our community, and for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is truly an honor to be here and really a privilege to have the opportunity yet once again to speak to our Jamaats who are so interested, in these fundamental areas of our belief, of our practice, of what makes us Ismaili Muslim. And so it really is, as I said, a wonderful privilege. So thank you to both of you, Farhana and Atash, and your committee members and the board for giving me this opportunity. As you said, I will be speaking about imamat. And when I say imamat, we all understand that to mean the Ismaili imamat. But what I want to do is in this session, I want to actually contextualize this whole idea of imamat. What do we mean when we use the term imam or imamat? And I want to begin so that we all understand that how is it that this term imamat has developed in Muslim history as part of the conceptual bedrock of Muslim society, of Muslim thought, of Muslim model of authority and leadership. So in that sense, I am hoping to position imamat as a Muslim model of authority and leadership. Within that, what are then the Shi'i expressions around imamat? And within that, what are then Ismaili interpretations of imamat and how we understand imamat today? So that's the journey I'd like us to take today. And I have some slides, which you are very welcome to have as a handout at the end of the session for those of you who wish to. So I'll let you work that out. But let me begin then by why should we look at historical foundations for a topic such as Imam, right? I mean, the question would be, we have the Imam Zaman, we have the Imam of the time. And so since we have the Imam of the time, do we really need to know the 1400-year kind of, trajectory that has led the Imamat to be what it is? And the simple answer is yes. And that is because what we take as a given as the Ismaili Imamat has a very solid foundation right into the Quran, into the time of Imam Ali, and each of the Imams after that up to today. So what constitutes Imamat for us today is, of course, what Maulana Hazri Imam articulates as Imamat, and he has done in several places. We are very familiar with this. For those of us who haven't had a chance to look at the preamble of our constitution, may I suggest that if there is one thing you pick up after this session, it's that preamble. Read it and you will see how it speaks about the Ismaili Imamat as a Muslim model of authority and leadership, and what are those connectors all the way from the notion of belief in God to belief in prophecy to then belief in Imamat and its developments. Right. So, and for those of us who haven't yet had a chance, listen to Hazri Imam's several interviews and speeches, but particularly the one he gave at the in Ottawa at the Canadian Houses of Parliament, where he talks about what is the Ismaili Imamat today. So we have a lot of language and articulations of what is Ismaili Imamat from our present Imam. How does it come to be so? How do we see about understanding that this is something that actually has a very long, centuries-old tradition, and why and how it impacts even today? Not just in Ismaili articulations of Imamat, but in the broader Shi'i articulations of Imamat, and I would argue in the broader Muslim conceptions and articulations of Imamat. So that, in a nutshell, is the journey I'm hoping to take with you. All right, so if we begin then and look at this whole idea of guidance, what is this notion of guidance and of guide? Now, if we take our minds back to how religious traditions began, all religious traditions, there is this sense that there is a creator, a divine figure, however understood and articulated, right? And that divine figure then communicates that guidance. Why? So that the knowledge about understanding about, and I use his not in a gender sense, but in a much more incorporating sense, so that the creator's understanding of, the creator's guidance about the purpose of creation and the return of the beings back to that creator. So this idea of salvation and the knowledge of that is imbibed in these figures. So in ancient polytheistic religions, you have figures such as prophets and priests who convey this will of God, who convey this guidance of God. In monotheistic traditions, such as Judaism, such as Christianity, such as Islam, this model of guides who have access, who have been given the privilege of the knowledge of the divine will and guidance is absolutely pivotal, and they come to be known as prophets, and in other traditions, patriarchs, priests, etc. Right? And so when we think about the Abrahamic traditions, and what do we mean by Abrahamic traditions? We mean Judaism, we mean Christianity, and we mean Islam. In these three, there is a model that develops around guide and guidance. God appoints prophets, who are then the divinely designated guides, and he sends his guidance. He sends his guidance of what he wishes his creation to know about his creation, but also about this return, which is why in our tradition, when someone passes away, we use the Quranic phrase, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun. Indeed, we are from him, and to him is our return. So this idea of the return, right, of salvation, as we can also call it. So this idea becomes fundamental and is common to all Abrahamic traditions. You have a prophet and you have a scripture. You have a guidance that is given to us through these prophets. All right. And when we think about these figures have religious authority as well as political authority. They are not, this idea of religious as being separate from the secular is, of course, we all know, a much more modern concept. That is not how any traditional society pre the last 100 years thought about knowledge. It was seen as embedded, right? If we then move on and look at how is it that prophethood and authority then develops in Islam, we all know the idea, the notion that the Prophet Muhammad receives revelation. We know the stories around this, in the Gare Hira, in the cave of Hira, he is inspired. Within tradition, it is understood that Gabriel came to him and imbibed the message of God. The first message, Ikra bi ismi rabbika, recite in the name of your Lord. And then the prophet continued to get revelations over the next 23 years. So he does not only receive the revelation, he is also entrusted to communicate that divine will, that knowledge, that divinely inspired knowledge to people, which is why, again, that very well-known verse that we recite of the Quran in our dua, Ati'ullaha wa ati'u rasula wa ulil amri minkum. This idea that the prophet is the one in whom that knowledge of the road, of the path of guidance, which we call Sirat al-Mustaqim, is then invested, right? And if we move forward, we then look at this idea of knowledge and salvation as being symbiotic, that they are absolutely ingrained. And therefore, all early Muslim conceptions of authority have certain common features. The idea that all power and authority belongs to God that the only legitimate authority on on earth are the ones who have been delegated as such by God. They have been designated by God. And what I just said earlier about Ati'ullah wa Ati'ur Rasulah, you can clearly see. And as I say, even we recite that in Adwa as a reinforcement of this idea that for us as Ismailis, as Shia, this idea of Ati'ullah, belief in God, wa Ati'ur Rasulah, belief in the messenger of God, is then continued in the divinely designated appointment of the imams, and therefore they are the ulil amr. They are the ones in whom this divinely inspired knowledge is invested. Okay, so if we go forward, we then see that if knowledge is this of the guided path is necessary to salvation, as we've said, as part of that broader understanding, and from where knowledge is attained, what happens when the Prophet Muhammad passes away in 632? How is that knowledge then to be continued in the community, right? So there are several debates and several discussions, and these discussions and debates and ways of thinking take several forms. Eventually, they coalesce into certain positions, into certain articulations, okay? However, whichever way these articulations happen, they all reiterate this commonality, that authority is invested by God in designated guides who are then to continue the guidance. Because you see, one of the big challenges that then the community faces is that, well, with the passing of Prophet Muhammad, what is to happen to the community? It was the guided community. How does it remain the guided community? Well, it remains the guided community through continuity of guidance. Makes perfectly logical sense. Where distinctions developed over time was that while imama, in the sense of leadership, in the sense of continuity of that divine guidance, is critical, who is it to be invested in? Who are the rightful authority? Who are the rightful guides? So if we move forward, we see this idea, eventually this idea of authority and leadership, encompassing both religious and temporal, eventually over several centuries, develop and coalesce in two major models of authority and leadership develop in Islam. And this slide is my slide to kind of give you a hook of what we will then further develop in the next slides. Okay, so a model where you have one figure, one authority, designated authority, as the one that is invested with this ilm, that receives ilham, that whose hand is guided, is the one who is the chosen one from the family of the Prophet, as decreed by God, and whose knowledge is protected by God. This model becomes the principal model for all the groups that later can divide into what is cumulatively called Shia Islam. Okay, so we will talk about these different groups briefly as well. But if I quickly remind you, when we think about the major Shia groups today, which ones come to mind? The Ithna Asharis, the Ismailis, and the Zaydis. But in history, you have several, you have more than 80 different groups that have come up at different times in different combinations around this notion of Shia Islam. Within what coalesced into becoming Sunni Islam, and when I say coalesced into becoming Sunni Islam, what I mean is that while with Shia Islam, the figure of Imam Ali, which was of course somebody, the Imam Ali was present in the time of the Prophet, as we know, and we'll speak a bit more about that in a few minutes. But unlike in Shia Islam, where the figure of authority and continuity of that authority was part of the earliest foundations of Islam, And therefore, the Shia model comes to be initially called Shiat Ali, the people who follow Ali. Okay? The Sunni model develops over almost 200 years. And eventually they come to be called, the Sunni is again a short form, their full name is Ahl al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Ahl, people who follow the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet, the teachings of the Prophet. So Ahl al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and the community, that they follow the consensus of the community. And of course, when they talk about consensus of the community, it can't be the entire community. So there is a particular class of people, what come to be called the ulama, those who have ilm, who then become these, whose consensus is thought to be the model. So in that sense, I'm calling it a corporate model, right? A group model. Okay, so if we now carry on, let's continue to develop our understanding and let's go right back. Okay, so here's a quote from Imam Ali, which is very powerful. And it says, "When I was but a child, he," meaning the Prophet, "took me under his wing. I would follow him as a baby camel follows the footsteps of its mother. Every day he would raise up for me a sign of his noble character, commanding me to follow it. He would go each year into seclusion. I saw him and nobody else saw him. At that time, no household was brought together for the religion of Islam, except the messenger of God, Khadija, his wife, and myself as the third. I saw the light of revelation and the message, and I smelled the fragrance of prophecy." Because as we well know from our history, Imam Ali was brought up in the household of the Prophet. Just as in the earlier years of the Prophet life, of Muhammad's life, he was brought up in Ali's household under his uncle, Abu Talib. So these two, Muhammad and Ali, in that sense, grow up like brothers. And so when Abu Talib comes into hard times and he then, is requiring some respite, Muhammad offers to have Ali brought up in his family. And so Ali was part of that household of the Prophet. That's how he grew up. And if we look at the next slide, we see that once the Prophet had received this revelation and he had had 3 years of receiving this, he receives a command from God that says, you now need to promote this religion, you need to pronounce it. And the Prophet is very concerned because he's worried that, if he starts to speak about this new religion, which talks about the equality of all beings, which takes away the social, political, economic, privilege of being for those who are of the Quraysh tribe, of which to whom the Prophet belonged as well, but that tribe, it was all tribal and it was hierarchical, that it takes that hierarchy away, that it creates a new way to glue society together. And that is to allegiance to the religion, to the faith, not to the which tribe you belong to. That this will have major repercussions, that in fact, the family of Muhammad himself will be the most serious opponents to this because it directly undercuts their privilege of who they had been in society, in all sorts of ways, religious, political, social, economic, all those ways. And by the way, I have deliberately put this particular slide in front of you. I know it's not easy to read, but it serves two purposes. One, it gives you a reference. MSc stands for Muslim Societies and Civilizations, which is a secondary curriculum module on history. And it gives you this entire story of the beginnings of Islam from before the time of the Prophet all the way up until the Fatimids. And it gives it to you in ways that are very engaging, lots of primary source quotes, has Imam's firmans and speeches, other ways of engaging the reader. So those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the Muslim Societies and Civilizations module and other modules that come after it, my genuine request is give it a chance. It's not just meant to be for our secondary children. It really gives us a wealth of knowledge for adults as well to learn. So something I wanted to mention to you. Okay? And these materials are available. They are available. Tariqa boards make this available. Hazruman's guidance was that this is not simply to be made available to step teachers and students, but these are materials that are extremely valuable for the Jamaat. So please make sure that you take benefit of that. So coming back to where we were, Ali growing up in the prophetic household, Ali smelling the fragrance of prophecy, Ali being appointed. So when this gathering is to now happen, Prophet turns to Ali and says, help me organize this dinner and invite all the elders of the Quraysh to that. And this source, which is a primary source, gives us the full story. That dinner happens, all these people arrive at the feast, they enjoy the food, and then the Prophet gets up and says, this is what I have received. I have received this revelation, and it is for the betterment of our people. And I am therefore reaching out to you. These are all my words. You can get exact words of what I have Imam Ali reported through this quote. I am completely paraphrasing and essentially saying to them, will you be my support? Will you stand by my side? Will you be my akhi? Will you be my wasi? Will you be my akhi? Will you be my brother? Will you be my wasi? Will you be the executor of this mission with me? Etc. And he asks once, and there is a stony silence. He asks again, and there is still a stony silence. He asks the third time, and Ali stands up, although he is the youngest in the congregation, because remember, Ali was only 13 when the Prophet received the revelation. So he is, in that sense, a young lad in this whole gathering of the seniors of the community, of the tribe. And he says, "Oh, Prophet, I will be your wazir. I will be your..." And the Prophet then puts his hand on Ali and says, "You will be my akhi, you will be my wasi," etc. Okay, so this is important because this idea that you will also be my khalifati, you will be my khalifa, you will be the one who will then deputize for me when I'm not around. Okay, so shall we move forward? And we notice that when it comes to giving Fatima's hand in marriage, she is the eldest daughter of the Prophet and Khadija, and we are told extremely loved by the Prophet. He chooses Ali as her husband and arranges the marriage. Although Ali wasn't one of the rich people, didn't have a significant dowry or anything of the sort. But this is yet another way in which the Prophet brings together the familial ties between himself and Ali. Okay, and if we go forward, there are these verses in the Quran which speak about the idea of the family, okay, and of the family of the Prophet. Words like Ahl, words like Durriya, words like Al. And these words are referred to in terms of the families of the prophets. And there is this particular verse that says, "Say, do not ask of you any reward for the conveying of this revelation." This is God saying to the Prophet, say to the people, "I do not ask of you any reward for the conveying of the revelation." Because remember, that was his role. He was to convey the revelation, except love for relatives. Right? So this idea of loving the relatives of the Prophet, loving the Ahl al-Bayt, is a Quranic notion. And when one of the major hadiths that is called the Hadith al-Thaqalain, is what the Prophet is supposed to have said, which says, I am leaving among you two matters of great weight, thakalain, heavy weight, right? The book of Allah and my kindred, itrat. Itrat is another word that you find in the Quran. The people of the house, of my house, the Ahl al-Bayt. And that these two shall never be separated until they return to me to the pool of Kawthar in paradise on the day of judgment. Okay. Now, with time, some Muslims interpreted this slightly differently. What Ahl al-Bayt came to mean, what Itrat came to mean, took on a range of meanings, and we will talk about that. But let's move to the next slide. And this is again from the MSC. And you will notice when you get a chance to read it yourselves properly, that it talks about this idea of the people of the Prophet's house as a Quranic notion, which was referred to even for Abraham, and it gives you the verse. But this idea, and also the idea that, again in the Quran, it talks about the point being that the Ahl al-Bayt have been purified, that they have been thoroughly purified. Okay, tahara is a word that then comes to be used, which in Fatimid times becomes one of the major pillars of Ismaili Shi'is that we can talk about another time. So, this idea of the Ahl al-Bayt, who constitutes the Ahl al-Bayt, became a majorly debated question. But the fact that there is the Ahl al-Bayt was accepted as a given. Right? For the Shia, the Ahl al-Bayt became those who were the immediate family of the Prophet. The Prophet Muhammad himself, Hazrat Fatima, Imam Ali, Hazrat Hassan, and Imam Hussein. Okay, and again, this particular code gives you this whole story of the Ahl al-Qissa, the story where there was a particular incident where the Prophet said that this is my Ahl al-Qissa, these are my people of the cloak. Okay, but read up if you're interested in it further. I need to move on to carry on our narrative. All this was said. And so for the Shia, when the Prophet passes away, the continuity of the guidance understood that there will be no prophet, that Muhammad was the final prophet, that he was the Khatim al-Anbiya, understood. But the idea of continuity of guidance for the Shia had been declared in each of these incidents. And it comes even more pronounced in the event of Ghadir Khum that we talk about, right? That's where on the final pilgrimage, the Prophet said, man kuntu mawlahu fa aliyun mawlahu. He whose mawla I am, Ali is his mawla, right? So for the Shia, that's not the beginning. That is the culmination of these various markers of Ali's continuity to authority. Okay. However, you have in Arabia, of course, several models of authority and leadership. One of them had been ruling by the eldest, and ruling through a council of elders. That was one model that had also developed in Arabia, right? And as part of those discussions, again, I know I am going through a whole lot with you, but I need you to then fill up any holes that you have in your knowledge. I've given you hopefully guideposts to where to go. Okay, so be that as it may, it so happened that a number of people gave allegiance to Abu Bakr, who was, of course, also one of the earliest converts to Islam. He had been by the Prophet's side when the Prophet did the hijrah from Mecca to Medina, etc., etc. Right? And so he comes to be selected. Okay? And there are those, when you look at this picture properly, you notice that there are three figures in this picture. This was done, by the way, in the 14th, 15th century. But it is trying to represent this giving of bayah of authority to Abu Bakr, Hazrat Abu Bakr, and next to him is sitting Hazrat Umar. But you can see these three figures who are turning away. And they represent this idea that even in that group of people who who gave allegiance in the Saqifa Bani Sada. There were those who upheld the right of Ali because Ali wasn't there. Ali was busy preparing the funeral arrangements for the Prophet. Okay, so if we carry on, we then have what comes to be called the Caliphate. The Khulafa Rashidun. We have Abu Bakr, Hazrat Abu Bakr, who becomes the Caliph for just over 2 years. He is followed by Hazrat Umar, who looks after the Caliphate for 10 some years. You then have Uthman, and then you have Hazrat Uthman, and then you have Hazrat Ali. Okay, so Imam Ali's Caliphate lasts from 656 to 661. Each of these are called caliphs, Khalifat Rasulullah, that they are Khalifa of the Rasul of Allah. That's how Abu Bakr begins. Omar then becomes the Khalifat Rasulullah, the deputy of the deputy of God. And when it is offered to Uthman, it is on that basis that he will be the Khalifa, the deputy of the deputy of the deputy of the Prophet of God. Okay, when Imam Ali takes on that responsibility, he makes it very clear that he would take it on as the deputy of the Prophet of God, Khalifat Rasulullah, that he would of course follow the teachings of the Prophet and of the Sunnah of the Quran and of the Sunnah of the Prophet, and then he will use his own means of understanding, knowledge, and experience to guide. Okay, again, complete shorthand of a very long story, but I'm hooking it there for you. If we then move on, we find that during the time of the Prophet and Abu Bakr, this expansion of the Muslim world already begins. So if you notice in this particular one, you aren't able to hear me properly, some of you, is that right? I'll bring myself closer, okay? Sorry, I didn't realize. You should have said earlier. Is that better? I hope you're able to hear me better. Okay, so you will notice that initially, of course, it is very close to Mecca. It's Mecca, Medina, that part of the Muslim world where the religion originally begins. Already in the time of the Prophet, it starts to expand. And by the time of Hazrat Abu Bakr, it expands further, as we can clearly see, across the Arabian Peninsula. So this religion is now expanding across these different peoples. If we go to the next slide, we notice that the Umayyads who take over after Imam Ali and establish their authority with Damascus as their capital, not Mecca or Medina. Damascus is their capital. Look at the expansion of the Muslim world. See how far it has expanded. Already by 750, you have Muslims settled all the way into present-day Spain and Portugal on one side, right across the southern shores of the Mediterranean, all the way across the Arabian Peninsula, and way, way, way into Central Asia, right? Now, when we go further and look at the next map, we see that when the Abbasids, who take over from the Umayyads, become the rulers, the empire expands even further, right? So when the Abbasids and the Umayyads claimed authority for themselves, they are now claiming to be caliphs over this far, far, far bigger regions of the world, right? And I now want to move to the next slide. By the way, each of these, Umayyads, Abbasids, and the four caliphs, each of these are chapters in Muslim societies and civilizations module. So any of you who, I hope I piqued some interest for some of you, and you want to know more, definitely make a point to read through those, and it will give you far more granularity than I am doing. Okay, what does this mean in terms of the imamate? What does it mean in terms of the model of authority and leadership? Here's what it means. The authority initially of the individual caliph over time actually shifts to what become called, as I said, the ulama, the scholarly community. Okay, so how does this happen? Under the Umayyads, you already find that they don't just call themselves Khalifat Rasulullah. They are not just the deputies of the Prophet of God. They call themselves Khalifat Allah. They are the deputies of God on earth. Do you see? So it's not that authority becomes separated into secular and religious. They are claiming to be both. And the same happens when the Abbasids take over. Okay? So while the caliphs claim to be themselves the caliphs of God, however, with this vast expansion that I showed you about the geographical expansion, the point is that the caliph now can't be the religious teachers. As Islam expands, how do people know about Islam? When it was in Arabia, Arabic was their mother tongue. They knew about the culture. They knew about the social realities. As Islam develops into all these other countries, in fact, Islam is for the first time now being introduced into a milieu in which there had been other religious traditions, Persian traditions, Byzantine, Greek traditions, Christian traditions, even as they expand into the Indian subcontinent and further, the traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, etc., Zoroastrianism in Persia. So you see that the people are now whom they are conquering. First of all, the language is not Arabic. Second of all, Islam is a completely new concept for them. And it is these people, it is these religious scholars who develop as part of this need, who eventually, there's a lot of, again, back and forth. There are several groups that develop. There are several Sunni madhabs that develop. You have the Hanafis, the Malikis, the Shafis, the Hanbalis that continue to this day. All of this happens. But in a nutshell, over a period of time, you find that this divine guidance is now represented as belonging to a combination of the Abbasid Caliph as a political leader and the ulama as the religious authority. Okay, and 11th century onwards, especially once the Abbasids lose their hold over their empire in that same way, over time, it is accepted that it is the ulama who are the rightful religious authority. And it is the ulama who look back at that time and reframe the caliphs before them, the Abbasids, the Umayyads, but particularly the first four caliphs as Khulafa Rashidun, that they were the rightly guided caliphs, meaning that the Umayyads and Abbasids aren't, but they now are the authority. Do you see? So that's how these shifts happen, and this idea of religious authority becomes bifurcated from this idea of secular authority or political authority, or however we want to call it. Okay, if we move forward, we then find that what happens among the Shia. So among the Shia, you also have splits, right? So in the time of Imam al-Baqir, you have his brother, his half-brother, Zayd, who wishes to take a much more activist stance. Because remember, Karbala had happened under Imam Hussein. Imam Zain al-Abidin withdraws himself from politics, unlike Imam Ali and Imam Hussein. However, Zayd feels that he needs to take on that kind of an activist position, whereas Imam Baqir and Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, who are extremely well known for their knowledge and are seen as among the most learned scholars of the time, want to now stay away from the politics for the moment. So you have a group that develops, which come to be called Zaydi Shia, which exists to this day. And we will talk about them a little bit as I talk about the contemporary expressions soon. But just to, so So there are these splits. After Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, we know that there were those who followed Ismail, us, who come to be called Ismailis, but there were those who followed Musa, who initially come to be called Musawis, and eventually when their Imam goes into Ghaiba, come to be called Itna Ashari, because it was their 12th Imam who goes into Ghaiba, and therefore Itna Ashar in Arabic. Okay, so again, a very quick kind of hooking on. Please feel free to read more, as I've said. If we move forward then, you then have several doctrines that develop in the time of Imam Jafar as-Sadiq. Okay, you have these ideas that God will never leave the earth without a guide to his path. This becomes a very particular feature of what come to be called the Imami Shia. When we talk about Imami Shia, we mean who later separated into Ithna Ashari and Ismaili, but separate from the Zaydis. So among the Zaydis, you can have any descendant of either Hassan or Hussein who can claim to the imamate. And he has to claim publicly. And if the claim is accepted and enough people join him, then he becomes the imam for the community. But equally, you can have several periods of time where there is no Zaydi imam. You can also have more than one Zaydi imam, because if two people claim that authority from this Ahl al-Bayt, from the descendants of Hassan and Hussein, and they operate up to all the descendants of Hassan and Hussein, unlike the Imami Shia, right? So for example, historically, we know that we had in Yemen and in the Caspian region, the region in Iran today, where later our Alamut period takes root. Yeah, in those two regions, there were two Zaydi imamates, both accepted and ruling as that. Okay, so this is a big difference. Okay, again, that the imamate is that it is vested in the descendants of Ali and Fatima. That there is always an imam as imam, always. Okay, and that he is the imam. He is the religious authority. He provides the spiritual guidance. He can take on political power if he wishes, but he doesn't have to. Whereas within Zaydi Islam, that becomes one of the primary conditions of imam. And that the imam is explicitly divinely designated. Okay? And if we carry on the next slide, we notice that there are certain concepts that when you read the preamble, for those of you who haven't, and for those of you who have, this will remind you, I'm sure, that ilm, knowledge, is again something that is seen as being divinely sanctioned. This idea of the zahir and the batin, this idea that there is the outward manifestation of the Quran, but that it is the imam who has the prerogative to provide the authoritative interpretation of the inner reality of the batin. Okay, this idea that of isma, that the support of the imams, the guidance of the imams is free from error. It is never erroneous because it is divinely guided. And this idea of the love and loyalty to the imam, the walaya, this idea of the bond between the believer and the imam, which is of course predicated not on enforcement, but out of love and loyalty. The idea of bayah that we talk about. My eye very quickly, just briefly caught a flash around commemoration of Karbala. Absolutely, but that comes under this broader sense of walaya, of expressions of love and loyalty to the imam, which takes several forms. I'm sure when Nargis speaks to you tomorrow, she'll pick up some of these in terms of practices. I am not doing that today, but definitely something to bring up with her if you wish to. Again, in the MSc, there is a lot of material, as well as if I can plug here the faith and practice module. You find that in the faith and practice module, you have it's not called faith and practice. It is called, remind me, one of you, Farhana or Atash. Hang on, I have it here. I just forgotten the name for the moment. Okay, I can't lay hand to it, but somebody will put it in the chat, the actual title. Faith and practice in Islamic traditions. Thank you very much. That's it. All right, so you will get a lot of understanding from that module as well, if that's what you're interested. I am simply at this point charting this out, okay? All right, if we carry on and go on to the next slide, we see that when the Fatimids come to power, they abide by this idea of the Ahlul Bayt being the five figures that we talked about, the Panchtan Pak, as we also refer to them, and they claim their authority to now rule over this entire southern Mediterranean, all the way from the shores of the Atlantic, right across the whole southern Mediterranean into Syria. And of course, their influence is much greater. It is into Yemen, and as well as, of course, in Sindh, Hind, as it is called at that time. That entire 170 plus years of their rule is predicated on their authority as the Ahlul Bayt, as defined earlier by Imam Jafar Sadiq. Okay, so that's the point I wanted to make about the Fatimids. Okay, let's move forward. Now, having set that scene for us in terms of foundational developments, let's look at contemporary articulations, okay? So if we go forward, what do we find? Remember the Zaydis, the Ismailis, and the Ithna Asharis. These are the three that are the major Shi'i traditions that I'll be talking about today, okay? If we go to the next slide. The Zaydis, I've already spoken about. So in Yemen, when you hear about these Houthis, at the moment, for any of you who are following that whole major humanitarian crisis, you will know that the Houthis are Zaydi. There are up to 8 to 10 million Zaydis in Yemen. There are a million or so Zaydis in Saudi Arabia today, etc. So they are a significant number of Shia, and they live in particular parts of the world. And as I said, their Imam can be present, but can also not be present, and that's how they function. And again, lots more to say about them, but I just want to make the point, the idea of how Zaydi Imamat works. Okay, if we go to the next slide, we find that there are as I said to you earlier, already by 943, the Ithna Ashari Imam had gone into what is called the Greater Ghaiba, Ghaibat al-Kubra, okay? How is the community to continue receiving guidance of the Imam-e-Zaman? Remember, they are Imam-e-Shia, so they have to have an Imam-e-Zaman when the Imam is in Ghaiba for all this time. So they have this understanding as it developed within their tradition, that these ayatollahs, the very name ayatollah, ayat Allah, the sign of God, right? These ayatollahs are the ones who know about the teachings of the imams, that they are inspired by these teachings, which is why in terms of giving khums, the 1/5 of contributions, these are given to these figures, who then invest it for the betterment of the community as best they see it. Do you see? One other point I want to make. The guidance has to be here and now. The guidance has to be present guidance. So if you are an Ithna Ashari family and you've been following a particular mujtahid, a particular ayatollah, and that ayatollah passes away, and you have children in your family who are under 18, while you can continue following that guidance of the ayatollah whom you were following, your children have to find a living guide, a living ayatollah to follow, because the guidance has to be living. So do you see that in their model, this idea of imama pervades? They see their own imam as the Imam-e-Zaman, whose guidance is permeated through these figures. We are not here about judging, now, is this right or is this wrong, or what it is. The point I am trying to convey to you is that what we call imamat and how we understand the role of the imam is in fact a broader notion. And for the Imami Shia, it reflects, even though their Imam is not present, in this form for them. If we go to the next slide, just to remind ourselves, among the Ismailis, we have a split after the death of Imam Mustansir Billah, and we have those who then followed Nizar, who come to be called Nizari Ismailis, who is us, and those who followed his youngest son, Mustali, who come to be called Mustali Ismailis at the time, and over time they've come to be called different things, Dawoodi Bohras, Suleimani Bohras, Alawi Bohras, etc., different names, right? In that sister tradition then, so they are Ismaili too, like us, right? In their tradition, how does this work? If you go to the next slide, we see that they have what they call Da'i al-Mutlaq, the chief Da'i. And their chief Da'i is in touch with their Imam, who they believe is not in Gaiba, because you can't have Gaiba in Ismaili model, but he's in Satar, just as we've talked about Dore Satar, periods of concealment of the Imam, where he's, to ensure his security and protection, he is not, he removes himself from the public gaze, as it were. Their Imam went into Satar. This is the Tayyibi line. Okay, the Tayyibi line. They also had the Hafizi line, which came to an end in Egypt, as far as we know. But in the Tayyibi line, they believed that Tayyib was a little child and he went into Satar. And this happened back in the 11th century, and he's still in Satar. But these Da'i al-Mutlaqs represent that guidance, represent that authority. Therefore, for those of you who have been following, you will notice that currently, there is a case going on in the High Court in Bombay about who is the rightful successor, the brother of the previous Da'i or the son of the previous Da'i, because they have made succession of the Da'is also mirroring those notions of nas and of inheritance and ilm, etc. Okay, so you can see how that notion of authority and leadership of the Imam and its continuity is maintained in that way. If we can go forward, I am going to run 5 minutes late. Is it all right? 7 minutes late. Is it okay? Sorry. Now let's look at broader notions. So we have this Hashemite king of Jordan. Why is he called Hashemite? I mean, he's a king, right? Because, again, when you get a chance, read this. Hashemites are, of course, what the Abbasids claim to be, from the family of the Prophet, from Banu Hashim, right? And the Abbasids had claimed that they are from the Banu Hashim, the clan of the Prophet, unlike the Umayyads who had been from the tribe of the Quraysh, okay, to which the Prophet belonged. And so it's very interesting that not only does the king of Jordan claim to be the Hashemite king, but when you look at the description he gives you of who he is, he finds it essential to tell us that the Hashemites are the direct descendants of the Prophet through his daughter Fatima, husband Ali, etc., etc. So when I do sessions at the Institute, I often don't give the information of who it is. I simply give the quote. And it can almost, up until a certain point, you would think, okay, well, this is a religious leader who is claiming direct Ahl al-Bayt relationship and therefore the right to authority and leadership, right? If we go to the next slide, what about the Saudi king? What about the head of previous head of ISIS? If you look at the Saudi king, again, what is it that gives him that authority? The fact that they rule over Mecca and Medina, right? And I have the next slide that I'll come to in a minute, but I want to stay on this for a second. Look at the figure on the right and the actual name of the person, which I've also given you. His actual name was Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim al-Badri, okay? Yet his public persona and the titles he claimed for himself were Amir al-Mu'minin, which is a title that for the Sunnis, Hazrat Umar got, and for the Shia, Ali was the Amir al-Mu'minin. Caliph, Abu Bakr, again, hearkening back to Abu Bakr, Hazrat Abu Bakr, al-Baghdadi, to the Abbasid, and then al-Husayni and al-Hashimi and al-Qurayshi. Do you see a figure as contested as that when it comes to talking about where their authority is legitimized and rooted are following the same precepts? It's a pool of ideas, shared pool of ideas that are hardwired in Muslim conceptual understanding, and therefore they relate to. And if we go to the next slide, here's something that is fascinating. If you look at the quote, it says the Wali al-Amr, which means the Saudi. Wali al-Amr, the singular of Ulil Amr. Same phrase, okay? To whom people delegate their affairs by virtue of the bayah. So you give your bayah to the king. Same phrase. Is responsible not to the people, to God, for his choices. And the decisions he makes and obedience to him is a duty according to the religious text and contract of the bayah. So people, in those who give their allegiance to the Saudi king, are his subjects who owe him that authority because of his legitimacy to authority as designated to him by God. And now look at the next one. After the Ramadan prayers in Mecca, there is a supplication made for the king, and it says, "Wawafik aimatuna, our imams, wawulati umurina," which is the same word as ulil amr again, right? "Wawulati umurina wa aidi bil haqqi haq imamina wa wali amirina, wali al amr." Make our imams and wali al amr successful and support them with the truth. But look at the language. It is using the same repertoire of language that we would find when we talk about religious authority in terms of imam. Okay, if we go to the next slide. When we then talk about Sufi sheikhs, people generally take a turn and say, so who are they? They are responsible for the spiritual guidance. They are they are the peers according to the Sufi traditions, who can be Shia or Sunni, etc., etc. And so we see them as religious leaders, right? But they are as much concerned about the welfare, the social welfare, the education, the health of their community. And several of these people, and I've given you examples of one, for example, from the States even, look it up. They run several organizations around health, around social welfare, around education, because it is in their job description. They're not simply religious heads. They are there for the betterment of their community. Okay, if we move to the next slide. Okay, so we come to Hazar Imam. When he has been interviewed, and you can get several examples, I had a hard time just whittling it down to 2 or 3 for our purposes. He was asked in this question, what is the role of the Imam today, of the Aga Khan today? Look at the way he answers it. He says, well, I'm a Shia Imam. I am the only hereditary Shia Imam within the Shia community of peoples. That's his distinction. He is the only Imam who claims to be the hereditary descendant of the Prophet Muhammad from Imam Ali all the way to today, the 49th. That's the distinction. But then look at what he goes to do. And an Imam in Islam, he doesn't say an Imam in Ismaili Shia or the Shia. An Imam in Islam is responsible for the security of people who are referred to him. He is responsible for the interpretation of the faith, and he is responsible for the quality of life. So those are the 3 areas which are my responsibility. So imama is understood fundamentally, formatively, for several centuries in Islam. That's the job description. And it continues to this day. And our Imam is part of that. The distinction is that he is the living Imam. He is the Hadir wal Mawjud. If you go to the next slide, look at the way he then positions it in this interview. He says the religious leadership of the Ismaili Imam goes back to the origins of Shia Islam, when the Prophet Muhammad appointed his son-in-law to continue the teaching. The leadership is hereditary. And then he says the other Shia, meaning the 12ers, revere a hidden Imam who will return on the day of judgment to take part in final judgment. He is not precluding their authority to affirm his. He's saying for them, that is their belief, that he will come at the end of time. But he says it is the presence of the living Imam that makes our Imamat unique. And then look at what he says. The Sunnis are completely different in that they do not accept the idea of continuity of religious leadership. Doesn't stop there. Do not accept the idea of continuity of religious leadership by members of the Prophet's family. That's the distinction. They too need religious authority. And the final slide. So he says, your community with its worldwide presence is unique within the context of Islam. And he says it is indeed unique, since it recognizes only one Imam who exercises his authority over all Ismailis throughout the world. And then he goes on to name these various regions and regions in which we live. And then he says, and he says this diversity of the fact that they live in these various parts of the world is actually expressed through our cultural and linguistic traditions and through the variations in which we practice our religion. But all Ismailis are united in the recognition of a single Imam. That's the distinction. And so is Imamat an Ismaili model of authority? Of course it is. Is it a Shia model of authority? Of course it is. Is it a Sunni model of authority? Of course it is. It is interpreted differently by different groups at different ways, but it is rooted in the very, very moorings of the foundations of the revelation and of Prophet Muhammad and of Imam Ali. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Jiwa. That was an absolute treat to hear. And I absolutely love the passion with which you explained and articulated all these ideas. But on that note, I would like to sincerely apologize to all our participants because we did not have time to take any questions from you at this moment. Because as you know very well, that this program is particularly first and foremost for our CPOI participants, and we have to switch to our smaller Zoom session with our CPOI participants in like next minute. So once again, I apologize, but I appreciate your presence, and I thank Dr. Shainool Jiwa for her wonderful presentation, and we all benefited immensely from your session at this moment. So thank you so much to all our participants, and I hope to see you all tomorrow once again for our session on rituals in Islam with Dr. Nergis Virani. You have some final words, Dr. Jiwa?
All I wanted to say was I'm truly sorry to keep you back, and I'm also very sorry that you weren't able to ask your questions. I did try to summarize as much as I could, but I needed to kind of come to the end of the story. So my apologies for those of you who felt you had questions and didn't get a chance to ask them.
And before I say the final goodbye, we all know that the Institute of Ismaili Studies has produced a list of publications that has responses, or at least a good starting point to all the questions that have been asked in our chat box. And like Professor said, and you have all been shared a link, the secondary teacher educator program, the curriculum that has a lot of modules on faith, on history, on devotional literature. So we all encourage our participants to take a look at those modules and to benefit from them. Once again, I thank you all for your presence, and I hope to see you all tomorrow. With that, Yali Madad. Thank you.